No? That's not right.
That's good. My name's Guy. I've emailed most of you. Thank you for getting back to me. When I speak at, for example, Rotary clubs about Wayside, I don't just talk about what we do or how we do what we do, but I actually talk about why we do how we do what we do. And so philosophy isn't some airy-fairy, ethereal thing out there. It actually drives everything we do here. And that's all come about through Graham, who 9 years ago, owning 2 full-time staff, 2/3 of the building pretty much were condemned, and not a cent in the bank. 9 years later on, we have 35 full-time staff, 450 active volunteers, $8.5 million was raised. It's debt-free to build this facility and restore the building next door. And that's all come about because of a very clear understanding that comes from why. And so Graham's going, this isn't a deep, heavy intellectual exercise. It's talking about philosophy, which is the passions of Graham, and as I said, affects how we do stuff in a really powerful way. Please welcome Graham.
It makes me sound so good I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say. Guy's been talking me into doing this for about 12 months, and I've kept putting it off. And eventually I weakened, and he said that, that he's booked in some dates and so on, so it's actually going to happen. So I envisaged a little room with 12 of us, so we could back and forth and get into some stuff. And what are you all doing here? I intend to go like a rocket. I hope you're okay with that. I think because we've got so many people, there's no choice, but also we're trying to cover a lot of ground. So I apologise for the speed. You can look at topics sometimes at helicopter level. We're going at spaceship level. So, we're not going to get into too much nitty-gritty. We're just going to keep flying. And I hope what we can do in a few weeks is give you a good overview of the culture we've inherited. In some ways, this is kind of backward-looking. If we were forward-looking, with the Asian century coming, we should probably be reading the Analects of Confucius together. And maybe that's not a bad idea for next year. We'll do Confucius. But I'm not very strong on that stuff, and I'm a lot better on this, so you're stuck with that. So the plan is, I don't know if Guy's still around, but the plan is we've got this week and next week, and then I think we've got a week off, and then there's 4 weeks. So we're roughly going to do classical philosophy tonight, medieval philosophy next time, then a week off. Then we're going to do modern, brace yourself, that's a week's worth. And then we're going to do postmodern, which is kind of where we are. And then we're going to do 2 weeks on Buber. And that seems probably very illogical, and probably is, but I'm just doing it because I can. What are you going to do, sack me? As far as preparation goes, we live in a different world now. My view is if you want to do any preparatory reading, just Google. The books I've read, don't worry about it, just Google. If for next week, if you want to Google medieval philosophy, or Augustine, or Aquinas, or Boethius, or if you really keen, Google a word called epistemology. Do you know what that is? Yeah. It's a study of the philosophy of how do we know what we know. And in a way, all of this is about that. So we'll just dive in, shall we? So the first thing I want to say is philosophy happens in history. It's a historically based thing. Philosophy doesn't live up here. So I want to do a really quick kind of history of the last 2,500 years. rocket ship style. The history of Western philosophy, the foundations are Greek. That is absolutely true. The foundations of Western philosophy are Greek. So Socrates, Plato and Aristotle is the ground we're going to cover tonight. So roughly 500 years before Christ. Alexander the Great, the reason why he's significant is Alexander conquered territories all over the place, and when he conquered you, you found yourself in his army, and he needed to find a way that his army could talk to itself, and so he invented a kind of a gutter Greek, and that gutter Greek became the trading language, the dominant language for all these hundreds of years, even to the point where in Rome the primary language was Greek. And Latin eventually took over, but even for some time after that, the language of diplomacy was still Greek. So I was in the catacombs in Rome. I'm not a big traveller actually, I've only been to Rome once, I did Europe once. But one of the greatest privileges of my life was I was in the catacombs and I found I could read the graffiti because it's in Greek. It was such an amazing thing to happen. So that's significant because the Mediterranean and the Middle East all had a language by which they could trade with each other. And that had never happened before, this kind of one language. This little cross is the birth of Christ. One of the reasons why Christianity could spread like cancer, it's probably not a very good metaphor, was that there was a common language. Okay, Constantine. If this is too boring, you can stop me, but Constantine was an emperor of Rome who, until his time, Christians were very much persecuted. The rumour was in Rome that they ate babies, and that's because Romans, if they had a girl, used to leave their babies on the tip. And the Christians decided they would rescue these babies. But they'd hear Christians talking about eating the body and the blood of Christ. So the rumour was that the Christians were eating the babies. So they were very persecuted. Constantine's mother was a Christian, and he was having this battle on the Milvan Bridge in the year 312, and got the idea that if he put this symbol, Cairo, have you seen that in the church? Yeah. I mean, it's the first two letters of the word Christ. Christos. That's all it is. So he got his soldiers to put this on the shield and he won the battle. And so he thought, oh, this is a powerful God. And not long after that, it became compulsory to become Christians, and most people in the church think that's when the church died. So, but it has absolute implications for the rest of history because the church became a powerful object that dominated society, and you had no choice. In fact, even up here, wherever Charlemagne is, when he's conquering parts of Europe, he gave an instruction to say, if you find any Saxons around who haven't come for baptism, let them die. So come for baptism or face your death. It's a form of evangelism, could be effective, I don't know. Willing to give it a go. So that changed things. Augustine actually, and we'll talk about him next week, he wrote in Latin but could also speak Greek. Augustine, I get in trouble for saying some things, but what are you going to do exactly? Augustine, more or less, Christianised Plato. Now that's a very simplistic thing to say, and in some ways that's not true, but at a very high level it's true. Augustine and Plato have a very strong connection. Once we start talking about Plato in a minute, you'll see it, you'll hear it, it still lives with us. And Aquinas has more or less Christianised Aristotle. So that's why this Greek thing still lives with us. It would be very, very pervasive. Boethius, I've thrown in. He was kind of a big deal, you know, through these years, but it's of no consequence now. The only thing that's interesting about Boethius, and we'll get onto him next week, was his theory of evil. You know, but we'll get onto that. That's a really good. I think it's quite tricky. He says evil doesn't exist, but it's real. It's a real absence. Get it? Like a shadow. A shadow is a real thing, but it's an absence of light. It's a good argument. So that's him. Aquinas. I put in the Crusades. You know, the Crusades were many and went for a long time. We call this the Dark Ages, and for fairly good reason. There are not fabulous times in our history. And what these Crusades did was, accidentally, we went over there to smash these Muslims and show them a thing or two, get their territory back. And what we found was a culture that was more advanced than ours in every way. The Muslims had actually run ahead with science. The Muslims knew more about philosophy, they knew more about astronomy, they knew more about science. And one of the accidental good things was that we learned that and transported some of this back to the West. And that's what gives birth to Aquinas and the school that follow him. This is a direct steal. Aristotle had been completely forgotten in the West. And it's out of the Crusades that a new light came. So we ought to be bloody thankful for the Muslims. Just thought I'd throw that in. Luther, this is the Reformation. This is actually, the closer we get to today, the more complex it gets. And you can't handle this without leaving lots of stuff out. But we should mark that the Reformation was a major kind of turning point. From here on, our culture was very keen on knowing how can we escape the authority of kings and bishops, whose authority was all pervasive. And so what they came up with was an authority of the Bible. You don't need the bishop, the Bible will guide us. But you see, underneath that is the capacity of the human mind to know. I can read this text and I can work it out for myself. See the vote of confidence in, this is what I'm talking about with epistemology. I can know this, and so that will guide me. So this sola scriptura, the scripture alone, also has underneath it an optimism about what we can know and what we can work out. And that grows like mad. We have the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, art changes, you know, all sorts of things change. This growing optimism, and I don't think I'll give you too much because we need to keep going, but it's ground will cover in due course. So this grows and grows and grows, this optimism, and then we get the 2 world wars, which are the most shattering thing that had an absolutely dominating effect on philosophy, the way we think. The First World War, I rate as a greater shock than the Second World War, especially for this country. We had a casualty rate of 64%, which was the highest of any country. I worked out once that in New South Wales, of all men who were of the age that you would normally think could be fathers, 45% went to war. And of those, 65% didn't come back. You reckon that might have had an effect on family life? And the ones who came back couldn't talk about what they'd been through because there's no words for what they'd been through. You know, even when I was a boy, my dad took me to the War Memorial Hospital, and there were still men in shell shock when I was a boy, under the bed and shaking. It was a shock beyond our wildest dreams. And of course, we allowed all the boys in one town to sign up together, and they go to the Battle of Somme. You lost all your boys in the town, just like that. So the effect on Australia was just astonishing, but it was an effect that was world wide, or Western world wide. And the political ramifications are huge, and 22 million people dead. 22 million. Now, in the Second World War, that was 60 plus million dead. When we get closer to it, I'll tell you why I rate the First World War as the biggest shock. But in some ways, the Second World War rehabilitated the idea of war. The First World War, they came home saying no more wars, and the Second World War, they came home saying no more Hitlers. They're kind of, but philosophy, and theology for that matter, after the wars, was all about what can be said after the Holocaust. Theology was, what can you say about God after that? And that has been the project ever since the Second World War. Same with philosophy, what can you say after the Holocaust, and what can you say after what we saw? And the growing optimism here came to a mighty crash when our smartness gave us the atom bomb. So our optimism came to a great crash. And so modern philosophy led to postmodern philosophy, and the themes in postmodern philosophy are all about deconstruction. I guess you know that. Do you know that? So let's save it till we get there. All right. Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. Let's go. 30 minutes, easy. Easy peasy. Are you still with me? Are we okay? Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's just talk about all of philosophy counts really Socrates as the beginning. He's the start of Western philosophy. But Socrates didn't get up one day and decide I'm going to start Western philosophy. He was in a context in Athens, which is a pretty interesting kind of a thing. Athens used to be once not a city, it was just a collection of little villages, and it slowly became, probably in some ways, it became a city, and it was a city that had incredible inequity between rich and poor. All you had was very, very rich and very, very poor, and that came to the point where their little economy was about to collapse. So they appointed a guy called Solon to fix it, and he cancelled all debts, and he released every slave who was a slave on account of debt. Boom. And then he created 4 classes of people, and that was based on money. So the upper class had the most money and power and all of that, but the lower class, the 4th class, paid no tax. In 507, they actually got our first democratic constitution. In some ways, it's not pure democracy because, at the time it was 300,000 people in Athens, and only 50,000 of those were considered free people. So when everybody got the vote, 50,000 out of 300,000 got it. It was close enough to everybody. The world power at the time was Persia, modern-day Iran, and the emperor of Persia decided he was going to have Greece, and so he did this attack in 490, which was, he put about 100,000 soldiers against 20,000, and he lost. 20,000 Greeks gave 100,000 Persians a hiding. That's kind of good. Any Greek would be happy to tell you about that. Then a little later, Xerxes, which is his name, decided he'd mount a much bigger battle. He had a navy of 1,200 ships, and he put them all against Athens. It's an interesting story. He got to Athens, it was there, nobody was there. So all of Athens had created this ambush, and they actually routed the Persians again. So the reason why it's relevant is there becomes, once he got that second beating, he wasn't keen to do it again, and so Greece had this extended time of peace, which is critical for what followed. Socrates was not in a vacuum. There were all kinds of philosophical schools at the time. Have you heard of Heraclitus? Heraclitus is the guy that said you can't jump into the same river twice. So he says everything's in a state of flux. And it's funny, in 2013, most of us in him have found a big vote of confidence. Because, his theory was, there's this river, all the molecules in that river going downstream. The next time you jump in, it's a different river, and all of reality is that kind of flux. So he came from this Ephesian school, and Parmenides, who came from a school called the Eleatic school, he said everything is permanent and everything belongs to a species and a kind, and the appearance of change is an illusion. So he won and he lost. And the effect that had on the rest of Western philosophy is astonishing.
You won?
Parmenides, the guy who said that reality is permanent, and if you see change, it's a bit of an illusion. There was actually, that school led to atomic theory, believe it or not. The ancient Greeks were talking about the whole of matter being made up of atoms. Can you believe that? There was another school that was very strong called the sophists. And the sophists used to say that for every argument there's a counter-argument, so who gives a shit? And they were clever. They used to teach rhetoric. It was a big deal. And you could hire them. So if you're in trouble with the law, they didn't care what the argument of the law was. There's always a counter-argument which is, equal to it. And you could hire them and they'd come and make your argument for you. That kind of relativism isn't entirely lost today either. Socrates thought the sophists were a pain in the bum. So let's talk about Socrates. Socrates loved the idea of truth. True wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. Now you'll see in a minute why this guy, I hope you can see why we count him as the father of Western thought. His mum was a midwife and his dad was a sculptor, and he said he was a midwife. So he said he wasn't a teacher, he wasn't teaching you stuff because he didn't know anything. He would serve you. And so if you had an idea, he would say, well, let's look at that idea and let's ask questions. The Socratic method is we ask questions and we test your idea. Are you starting to see the beginning of a scientific method? You propose a hypothesis and we'll question it until we see a better hypothesis or something that works. That's his. So he said, my biggest gift to the world is that I know nothing. I actually think that's pretty good. I must say the best teachers I've ever had have been people who don't claim to know anything much. Most people who claim to know everything, will say that we won't be unkind. So he used to say he was a midwife. So he would say, I will help you pull this idea out of yourself. And I don't know if we're going to give birth to a baby or a bunch of wind. It's good, isn't it? No, it's really cool. Okay. So he says when you're born, you know everything that you could possibly know at birth. You believe in reincarnation. So he said all knowledge you've already got. And when you come to know something, you recognize it. You recognize it. So he also, and this got him killed, he believed that an individual conscience could take precedence over the law. Now they made him drink hemlock, and the official charge was blasphemy, but it was always blasphemy and it always offended some god. But the real story was he taught young men that their conscience could trump the law. That was his real offence. Okay, that's him. Happy to move on to Plato, that was easy. Plato. That's I've got to come here. Plato was the student of Socrates, and Aristotle was the student of Plato. Plato and Socrates didn't write anything down. All we know about Socrates comes from Plato's writings, and a lot of Plato's writings exist. You can read them. Plato saw the world as divided between, this word is a Greek word, ontos, which we use the word idea, but it's better translated meaning. Actually, in English we use the word ontological, don't we? Yeah. Ontos means to be. So the realm of ideas, and in the realm of ideas, things are ideal. You know, they're permanent, they're spiritual, and they're available to you through thought. That's how you know these things. And so there's the realm of ideas, and there's the realm of phenomenon, which is appearances, things as they seem. So matter, space, time are all phenomenon rather than ideas. And these things are available to you through your senses. So can you get this? You know, in the realm of ideas is the ideal world, and in the realm of what we see is of a more lowly nature. So for Plato, reason is way up there, but body is way down here. It's, you know, Western culture is starting to form now. So just back to the idea. So everything we see gets its form from an idea. So in the realm of ideas, in the world of the forms, the triangle exists perfectly in its form, in its mathematics. The triangle exists. But every triangle we come across in the world is deficient in some ways. Every triangle is trying to be the perfect triangle in his language. Get it? Okay. So a human being is body and soul. And he said one of the worst ways you can waste your life is to try and worry about the fitness of your body. Because you should be prepared to die happy, and that's got nothing to do with bodily fitness. It's just a lower thing, it's just a body. Can you see how Augustine picks this up, and see how the Catholic Church picks this up, and we start to say it's better to be celibate than married? Actually, Socrates said you should marry, and he said if you marry and you get a good wife, you'll be happy, and if you get a bad one, you'll be a philosopher. Yeah. Actually, no. So this divide is already here. It's very much out of fashion these days to divide the body and the soul. Or those Greek words are soma is body,